Hey everybody, welcome once again to the Winning Digital Customers livecast. I hope that you are ready for a fantastic Halloween. Have you got your costume all set? I want to talk today in the spirit of Halloween about something that I think a lot of businesses are terribly afraid of and why, I don't think you should be all that afraid. And what I am talking about are the digital giants of the day: Amazon, Google, Facebook, Netflix, Airbnb, Uber, the companies who seem like they are taking it all in the digital world. For some businesses, many businesses, these are the ghosts, goblins, Frankensteins, and Draculas of their day, right? These are the entities that keep them awake at night, fearful that they are hiding under the bed, ready to reach out and grab them and strangle them and put them out of business. And in fact, these are some tough competitors, and you should be wary of them, mindful of them, and strategizing on how to run a successful business in an era where many of these companies are dominant. There's no question. But today I'm going to tell you 3 reasons why I don't think you should be afraid of them. And in fact, a little bit about a different mindset that you should have towards them that can send you in a direction of perhaps what you should be doing to be the most successful in an era where some of these companies are absolutely dominant. So, 3 reasons not to be afraid of the digital giants. Whether you're a large classic brand or whether you're a small business, doesn't matter. 3 reasons not to be afraid. Reason number 1, these companies are not immortal. It may seem to you like when these companies are so dominant, nothing can be done to take them down. They are here, they are permanent, and they will be the dominant force forever. And so therefore, if you want to compete with them, if you want to start a business perhaps that is in competition with them, or your brand is already in competition with them, or you want to launch a new product that might be in competition with them, these guys are owning the space that they are in, and they will own it forever, and there's nothing that can be done about it. I think that history will show us that this is not correct. There's a famous quote from a few years ago from Jeff Bezos, who said, "Amazon is not too big to fail. One day, Amazon will go bankrupt. Large companies have lifespans that tend to be something like 30 years, not 100 years. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this. There are companies that last 100 years. And of course, there are many companies that go out of business even faster than 30 years. But there's no question that the large players of a given era don't generally tend to be the dominant players of the next era. Again, there are always exceptions. So we can expect that there is room for new entrants to come in and potentially take over some of the leadership roles in our world today, whether that's in retailing or media or transportation or social media or whatever. I mean, remember MySpace when that was the #1 social media platform, right? Remember AOL? It doesn't take that long for someone new to come in. I'm sure for Mark Zuckerberg, when he created Facebook in his dorm room, the thought of going up against someone like an AOL would have been probably pretty intimidating. But good for him that it didn't stop him from getting started, because obviously today his empire dwarfs that of AOL. But let's just look at a couple of additional concrete examples, and let's look at some numbers. One retailer that at one time dominated the retail landscape was SEARS. So just as an example of the fact that the dominant players are not immortal, in 1969, SEARS was America's largest retailer. Their revenue was approximately 1% of U.S. GDP. About 1% of the entire U.S. economy was the sales of SEARS. And 67% of Americans shopped at SEARS. That's where they were in 1969. And I'm sure that any company thinking of going into the retail business at that moment in time probably thought, how the hell could we possibly compete with SEARS? Now, let's look at that in comparison to Amazon, because you might say, well, that was another era, Howard. Come on, that was the 60s. Today's entrenched players are, it's a different story. Well, maybe, but let's just compare. They're so much bigger. They're so much more dominant today. than someone like a Sears ever was. Well, is that true? Let's take a look at Amazon's numbers. So Sears, 1969, America's largest retailer, 1% of GDP, 67% of Americans shop there. What about Amazon? Today, and these are some numbers from last year, 2020, Amazon is America's second largest retailer. Walmart is the largest by a very large margin, by the way. But nevertheless, Amazon is obviously quite a dominant figure, second largest retailer, and they represent about 1% of the US GDP. Interestingly, as a percentage of the economy, Amazon today is about where Sears was in 1969. And 63% of Americans shop at Amazon. So we have very similar numbers. It's actually slightly lower, right? They're the second and not the first, and it's 63% of Americans and not 67% of Americans. But nevertheless, remarkably similar profile. And of course, what happened to Sears? Well, Sears went from having 3,500 stores to, I think today they have something like 30 stores, largely out of business with a few exceptions. They've shed almost 250,000 jobs. Sears is obviously a company that didn't change with the times, did not transform, and today is largely irrelevant in the retailing landscape. Now, I'm not saying that's what's going to happen to Amazon, but Jeff Bezos predicts that someday Amazon will go bankrupt, that the life cycle of a large company may be only 30 years. And well, there's some reason to think that there might be a way to drive a stake through the heart of Amazon, to shoot Amazon with a silver bullet or whatever other mechanisms you use to kill the monster of your choice. Not saying it's going to happen for sure, but no reason to think that Amazon is immortal. Let's just look at a couple of other examples. This is, again, the first reason not to be afraid of today's digital giants. Let's talk about another early digital giant, in a way, Nokia. In 2010, Nokia was the leading manufacturer of cell phones. They had 34% of all handset sales globally. 34% of all cell phones globally sold in 2010 were Nokia phones. Remember the snake game on the Nokia phones? And at that time, they had over 50% of all smartphone sales, albeit a small market in 2010. But I think at that point in 2010, the iPhone had come out. So even after the iPhone was launched, and for a period of time, Nokia was selling more smartphones than Apple, and obviously 30% of all the handset market. Clearly, way more phones than Apple, way more phones than Samsung. Today, Nokia represents less than 3% of the global handset market, and obviously they were bought by Microsoft, and they're a shadow of their former selves. Not to gloat or to be happy about Nokia's demise, but again, at some moment in time, someone must have looked at Nokia and said, these guys are dominant. How can we possibly go up against them? Times change, things change, monsters die. Let's look at the Fortune 10. These are the top 10 companies as ranked by Fortune between 2010 and 2019. This is just happens to be a chart I found online comparing those two different years. From 2010 to 2019, we have only 3 companies that were able to hold their position in the Fortune 10. Walmart, ExxonMobil, and AT&T. Interestingly, Walmart and ExxonMobil not only held their being on the list, but stayed in the exact same positions as number 1 and number 2 in the Fortune 10. So good for them. Congratulations to them. AT&T remained, dropping from number 7 to number 9. Every other one, all 7 of the other companies in the Fortune 10 are completely different from 2019 to 2010. And you can see how much revenue it takes to be in the Fortune 10. So clearly, those that dropped out had substantial drops in revenue, and those that joined it had substantial increases. And we see the elimination of companies like Chevron, General Electric, Bank of America. Now, of course, that doesn't mean they went out of business, but they clearly dropped from being the level of dominance they formerly were. And then we see the addition of companies like CVS, Berkshire Hathaway, Amazon, and Apple on the Fortune 10 list. And so more evidence of the fact that even though these companies that are no longer on the Fortune 10, no doubt, are probably still in the Fortune 500, substantial change that can happen over time. And by the way, let's just take a moment and think about what it must have been like when Amazon, because Amazon, of course, is one of the most feared monsters in today's business landscape, whether you're in the retail business or whether you're in the media business where Amazon Prime is becoming dominant, or whether you're in the technology business where Amazon Web Services is becoming dominant, or any one of the other areas in which Amazon operates, clearly they are a scary figure to many industries. But there was a moment when Amazon was a startup. In 1996, not that long ago, Amazon had $16 million in sales. And at that time, Barnes & Noble was the #1 bookseller. At that moment, that was mainly the only thing, or just about the only thing that Amazon sold was books. They were doing $16 million a year. Barnes & Noble was doing $2 billion. So today's giants were today's Goliaths were once David, and the Goliaths of yesterday, in many cases, have fallen from their perch. And this is likely to happen again and again and again. So, okay, bottom line is the monsters of today are not immortal. Hopefully I've put that one to bed. And just a few more examples. Kodak, Blockbuster, Woolworths, all former huge brands, either completely gone and out of business or a tiny shadow of their former self. So hopefully I've persuaded you that you don't need to worry that today's giant monster companies are immortal. The second reason that you should not be afraid of today's giant monsters. They're not perfect. Everything they do doesn't come out wildly successful, like Frankenstein's monster, right? A little bit of a ugly and failed experiment. Well, no matter how big the company is, you can find things that they're doing which are not successful, failures. And of course, those failures are opportunities to be wherever they're failing, someone else is succeeding, right? In every category, I'm going to show you a few examples. In every category that a Google tries to do and fails, or an Amazon tries to do and fails, or an Apple tries to do and fails, generally speaking, somebody is succeeding, which means they're getting beat all the time. Maybe not overarchingly. It may be that, there's no entity that's bigger than Amazon in e-commerce in the US today. That's true. But within certain areas and certain things they've tried to do, others have been more successful. So just a few quick examples to prove that point. Google Plus, one of the most dominant technology companies in the world. Google saw the rise of social media, and in 2011 they launched Google Plus, which was their Facebook killer, right? What they were going to do to take over the social media market from other companies, which at the time were much smaller. Back in 2011, 10 years ago, Facebook was not at the scale of revenue that it is today, where you can see it side by side with Google. Facebook was more of an upstart. Facebook was just growing. And Google decided that they were going to go after what Facebook was doing. They came out with Google Plus, and of course, largely unsuccessful. And that was actually shuttered in 2019. 8 years later, low usage, low revenue, other reasons, security issues. Ultimately, they decided, forget it. They shuttered Google Plus and they got out of that business. Similar story, the Amazon Fire Phone. With all the success that Amazon has had in devices like the Alexa and the Kindle, Amazon decided to create their own phone, the Fire Phone, launched it with great fanfare. They were trying to compete with the Samsungs and the Apples of the world. They spent over $170 million building and launching and marketing the Amazon Fire Phone. In the end, they were trying to give them away practically. They were trying to sell them for only 99 cents. And even at that price, they were not able to sell a significant number of Fire phones. And eventually, Amazon got out of the mobile phone market, and they are no longer in it. So again, examples of these companies, they are not perfect. They try to compete in certain categories and are unsuccessful. And lots of other examples can be, remember New Coke, right? Coca-Cola, a dominant consumer packaged goods company. Netflix at one point decided to rebrand their DVD by mail service to separate it from their streaming service, calling it Qwikster. Massive customer backlash. The CEO of Netflix had to give a huge mea culpa. They lost a substantial number of customers. They lost a lot of goodwill, and it was a huge mistake and created a moment of competitive weakness. And there's lots of examples where large, giant, dominant companies, the watermelon Oreo product, Colgate at one point tried to come out with beef lasagna. It's easy to see across these companies areas where they're unsuccessful, which, by the way, one could argue is one of the reasons why they are so successful, is that they're willing to try a lot of things and they're willing to fail. So I'm not trying to make fun of these companies or suggesting that they're bad for not succeeding in every area. But as a competitor of these companies, it's important not to get intimidated and say, oh, Amazon's coming out with their phone, they're going to be dominant, forget it. Or, Colgate is coming out with beef lasagna. How can my beef lasagna ever compete with a giant brand like Colgate? What the heck is Colgate thinking coming out with beef lasagna? After the beef lasagna, I guess you have to brush your teeth. So they're creating business for themselves. I don't know. But in any case, so just remember that. Just because a giant like Facebook or Netflix or Google or Amazon or whatnot is going into a category or competing head-to-head with a product you have, as dominant as they are, doesn't mean they're going to be dominant in that area. And the last thing is, they don't eat everything. They're not like Godzilla trying to consume the entire world. In fact, there are many niche areas where you can compete with these giants in a way that fills a gap that they're not either trying to fill or they're not trying very hard to fill and therefore aren't doing it all that successfully, or a category that just doesn't play to their strengths. So let's just look at a few examples. Wine.com is now up to $200 million selling wine. Amazon doesn't sell wine. It seems like they sell almost everything under the sun, but there are some things they don't sell. And it requires a lot of specialized knowledge to be able to sell a highly regulated product like wine, where you're shipping it, worrying about the age of the person who's ordering it. So I think it's just a product that's maybe requires too much concern, care, and specialization for Amazon to want to worry about. And so they went out of that business. Another business that Amazon went out of is the educational textbook business. While lots of students buy books from Amazon, that may be needed for a college course. If I need to read Moby Dick for a college course, of course I can buy it on Amazon. But for a while, Amazon decided to go into the textbook market and really focus on fulfillment of really hardcore textbooks. And they realized that similar to wine, it's got a lot of intricacies and nuances and needed to get class lists from different colleges so people could look up and find out what textbooks there. If you want to compete with the local college bookstore, you need a lot of data and information. And Amazon, I think, ultimately decided too much trouble, and they exited that business. So again, another example of an area where you can run a successful book business competing with Amazon, or in this case, not even competing with them exactly, but effectively operating in a niche that Amazon is not focused on. Gift boxes, subscription gift boxes, another huge business. Stitch Fix, which is a monthly subscription of a clothing box you receive, $2.1 billion business. Amazon, to the best of my knowledge, doesn't even have a business in this space, despite it being apparel retailing, an area where one would think that Amazon is incredibly dominant. And they're huge in that space. But here's a niche within apparel retailing that Stitch Fix has been able to create an over $2 billion business. Look at Etsy. Etsy comes along and says, hey, you one-off unique crafts. This is something that Amazon is not selling. And even eBay, while you can, of course, go ahead and sell your painting on eBay, Etsy figured out how to create a better marketplace specifically just for that. Etsy also is over a $2 billion business today. So if you look at the marketplace and think, gosh, there's these giant retailers, how will I ever compete? Lots of companies are finding ways to compete. It's not about ignoring Amazon. You need to be mindful of where they are and what they do, but about seeing the fact that they're not trying to eat everything. And maybe some of the things that they're not focused on is an opportunity for you. And let's just look at one more. Let's look at Netflix. And even if you combine Netflix with some of the other leading streaming services today, like HBO and Hulu and Disney Plus, it may seem like between all of these guys, how can a new streaming service come in and compete? Well, Crunchyroll, for example, a service that my son subscribes to, is an anime-only streaming service. And they have all huge selections of anime programming. That's, like Japanese animated cartoons, massive numbers of that, very specialized. They're running almost $100 million a year business, just focused on a subscription streaming service for anime. I'm sure there's some anime on Netflix, but it's not something that they're focused on. It's not something that they're expert at. Crunchyroll is able to fill that role. Shudder, another subscription streaming service specifically for horror films. Again, there are horror films on all these other services, but if you love horror films, this is a service that's more specifically tailored to your needs. And lastly, Fubo, which is a business streaming international sports programming, especially soccer, what would be called in Europe football. And so that is another subscription service, $330 million business, filling gaps in the market that other more dominant streaming services are not. So again, these leading digital giants, these monsters of our age, are not necessarily trying to eat everything. And by paying attention to what they're not eating, you can be successful too. So in summary, 3 reasons this Halloween not to be afraid of the digital monsters of our era. Number 1, they are not immortal. Number 2, they are not flawless. They are not perfect. They make mistakes, and not every product they launch is successful. And number 3, they are not trying to eat everything. And so by identifying those areas that they're not focusing on, sometimes you can build a multi-billion-dollar business. So that is my Halloween episode of the Winning Digital Customers Livecast. Don't be afraid, but have fun. Enjoy your trick-or-treating. Enjoy your time with your kids. Enjoy your costume parties. And I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Winning Digital Customer Livecast. Until then, keep transforming.